Alessandro, Brett, Matthew. It's fantastic to have this opportunity to speak with all of you today. So, Brett, I want to dive right in. What are the main challenges that you think people need to be aware of regarding emerging technology and the way it's going to impact society?
Yeah, so I think there's some surface level challenges that a lot of people are already noticing. And in particular, I think with any new technology, there's this tendency to outsource certain human functions and faculties that the technology makes easier. So I think with AI in particular, you're looking at a big shift in education and the way that we come to know things and know the world, which is very different than what we experienced with text and some previous media. So, I think there's almost an epistemic shift happening. So, how we perceive, how we know. And so, as an educator, I think about that because knowing and learning is a process of adequating the intellect to reality. And the more virtual that our mediums become for accessing that reality, that adequation becomes a little more removed. And so, I'm also a parent, and with children, so much of learning is somatic, it's, social. And so these are elements I think that technology tempts us to replace or modify in ways that aren't always necessarily good um, for human development.
And Brett, if you look at technology's ability to make certain aspects of of accessing information, of sharing information, of kind of democratizing that information, that all seems fantastic. Where do you feel that critical aspects of that pursuit of knowledge or of the hard work of getting knowledge, is that what you're saying is going to we're going to offload, or we're not going to have that experience?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I mean, I think there's some knowledge we gain through the sort of synthetic search of a database of information that
Mhm.
that can reveal new things to us about the world. But so much of learning happens in an embodied way, in a social way, and so I think for developers, for educators, for parents, for policymakers, I mean, I think the questions we have to wrestle with are those sort of ripple effects of the new technology. What are the epistemic effects? How do we come to know the world differently through these mediums than we did before? So, yes, we have this sort of torrent of information that's available to us through these networks and databases, but then we get into the problem of discernment and sifting of what is real and what is false. And that requires, I think, a second level of intellectual capability that, yeah,
Mhm.
again, a teacher, a parent has to be there for. And so the idea that we can, again, offload some of these functions, education and so on, without the sort of human intermediary is risky.
Mhm. And Alessandro, what are some of the challenges that you see with emerging tech that you're worried about, or you're thinking about?
Yeah, I think one is in just the personal formation of the person, what it means to live and seek for a life of virtue, and some of the obstacles that these newer technologies are presenting as kind of shifting our gaze away from what is our ultimate search for virtue and route to heaven. I think when we are in an environment where more and more becomes easy, and we try and think about how we can be most efficient to do the least amount of work to achieve comfort. I think we avoid the reality that labor is inherent in man, and it's in our labor, in our work, that we discover our call. We apply our gifts as stewards, not as our gods in and of ourselves. And I think we see that more in the educational setting when it comes to students writing papers, for example. Like, part of what it means to develop the intellect and your soul and understanding of the good is to wrestle with the topics. Right? In some ways, the answer is not the essay or the answers to the test, but you're wrestling to understand and implement those in your lives. I think that extends to our work as individuals, whether it's knowledge work or physical work. Um, the more we kind of outsource the thinking, the wrestling with reality, the more we go into the virtual world where there isn't the physical, suffering and hard labor, and we retreat into the purely mental act of deliberation. I think we lose part of what it is to be incarnate beings, and that can really obscure, I think, the reality of man, and that has many social and personal consequences. I think that's contributing a lot to the anxiety, the isolation issues that we see, the further deterioration of community. in all its social effects, but ultimately also theological and spiritual community, which is, not great.
And Matthew, what about you? What challenges are you thinking about when you see the way emerging technology is entering ever more presently into our day to day life?
I think if I had to pick one thing, the thing that kind of concerns me the most is not so much the technology. It's the fact that we know that the technology is going to be more and more and more, right? And in large part because maybe there's a spiritual poverty there where people just don't, especially when with AI and robots doing more and more in society, there'll be, I think, more and more people with a lot of time on their hands. My concern is what people will do constructively with that time, right? If they don't know the value of developing one's spiritual life or developing friendships, right? Or finding a spouse, or they don't know how to even begin that journey, then I worry that a lot of people will just, without even really like wrestling with it, just kind of opt to disappear into gaming worlds or virtual reality. What kind of concerns me and I feel very convicted about is I feel like a lot of people are gonna start are gonna take that journey, and of course they'll be chasing those dopamines off a cliff because ultimately they're not gonna be satisfying, right? And that existential cliff is some call it, is something that concerns me the most. That a lot of people will simply will use these technologies, will chase those dopamine hits and arrive at the edge of that cliff, and because they have no other hope, they don't know of any other way, they'll leap, right? And so I think the thing that concerns me the most is ensuring that the church recognizes that we have to be far better at leveraging this technology in as Catholic way as possible. If for no other reason, we have an obligation to ensure that the truth and our Christian way of life is made present to as many people as possible.
Mhm. And Brett, if I may turn to you, how different in terms of a challenge for society is AI to past technology? I know, growing up, when I was in high school, social media, and more particularly in college, social media really started to become something that was part of everyday life. It was almost moment to moment, and people, called like kind of 2010 to 2020, really that social media era. It changed our, the way we run political campaigns. It changed marketing, and it's obviously, had some aspects that are very fantastic that people are able to communicate and stay in touch, but there's been an enormous emotional, mental cost to that, and it's really, it's inserted itself into everything. How different is AI to past challenges that we as a society have had to confront?
Yeah, I think it feels very different. Although I used to think of these technology epics as being kind of almost hermetically sealed, right? We went from oral to scribal to print, and somehow, when we went from scribal to print, all the manuscripts just disappeared overnight, and that wasn't the case. There was this whole period of transition between the two media that really defined how the new medium got adopted and used. And I think we're in that transitional moment right now between, as you say, social media, but I would also include television. And so, when you come out of a paradigm like television and social media that's so driven by advertising, entertainment, fantasy, connection, then naturally the new medium is going to kind of import those sensibilities and try to kind of repurpose them or resell them in a new skin. And so I think we're just now starting to see what AI is capable of that previous media were not. And that's the exciting part. And I think in some ways it's the unsexy stuff of like being able to read, massive amounts of medical telemetry data to make better diagnoses, or not that it's unsexy, Matthew, but to catalog libraries, right, of sources that many people didn't have access to before. So a big boon for researchers. But again, if you think about where we came from with television, social media, people want to be entertained, they want to be amused, they want to be distracted, and so chatbots and generative AI and the kind of virtual imaginary spaces become very profitable, but they're not always maybe the best use of the technology. So I think that that's really old, right? That sense, and I think the newer things that are happening are the more exciting, and maybe we're more mature now in our technology use that we might be able to move beyond just sort of creating new fantasies with every new technology that we develop.
Mhm. And Alessandro, when you see new things that AI is able to provide and bring to the world, what excites you? Where do you see that there's the most opportunity or the most ability to kind of, I guess, create that positive impact that we're looking to do?
Yeah, maybe one quick comment on the prior question. I think there are ways in which it's a progression down the same type of spectrum, and I think there's ways in which it's creating a new fundamental lens to approach the world. I think there's a way of viewing the last few hundred years of the first industrial revolution being about trying to incorporate as much human capital into productive, concentrated use and the application of human labor and capital, producing basically the middle class, right? The industrial middle class in the capitalist context. In the initial advent of the software revolution, that started to change by trying to add the concept of operating leverage to business. And it's how do we have a given amount of capital have the highest leverage by minimizing human labor per unit of capital. That created massively transformative companies, transformed how we interact with the world, but also furthered continued concentration of wealth and hollowed out in many ways the middle class, the industrial middle class in the US. I think in some ways AI is the like approaching at the limit of that, where you need, billion-dollar companies made by one person, right? And so that's in a way progression down that pathway, but in a different way. I don't think we confused any of the mediums that Brett talked about, that we interacted with, TV, social media, as intelligence, and kind of the introduction of this idea of like, we are now approaching what humans are, just with a different substrate. And I think a kind of pernicious assumption there that sneaks in is that all humans are is just really complex calculation in a way that LLMs manifest, as an example, manifest in interactive language, but are inherently matrix math, to be overly simplistic. That gives us a really I think malformed idea of what a human is, and I think that can creep in really dangerous ways on how we look at ourselves, and trying to maximization of the cans of our life instead of the search of the oughts of what we're being drawn to on a spiritual level. So some comment on that.
Alessandro, I love that. And if I can just jump on that, one thing that we're seeing, very clearly is that a lot of the people who are driving these major AI companies, these major tech companies, they have an ideology, a philosophical outlook that is very, there's very many of them are transhuman, and they see that people are exactly that. These calculators. First off, I have two questions. What does that do when the drivers, the leaders in these industries are pushing that type of philosophical and ideological outlook? How does that change our society? And of course, how can we push back? And secondly, if there isn't a resistance that's proper, that's able to push back on that at a certain point, this is kind of what Matthew was talking about with the existential cliff. People can lose hope, and that's, of course, as Catholics, we have a duty to be people of hope, and the church has a duty to respond. Brett, if I can throw that to you.
Yeah. The trans thing is really pernicious in a way because it is insidious. It's sort of baked in technology, and technology is always, I think, ideological and political. And it's not always clear in the application or the surface use of it that there's something going on behind the scenes that's deeply philosophical. I mean, in some ways, I feel like we're retrieving the Middle Ages in a way. We're trying to do alchemy again. We're trying to turn math into language. It's almost kind of Kabbalistic, kind of conjuring language out of these, mathematical, statistical tokens and so on. So I think the idea that we can reduce humans or human intelligence and reason to that is troubling. And of course, we've all heard the sort of Ray Kurzweil mythologies about the singularity and offloading, uploading consciousness to machines and so on. It feels like we're getting closer to that in a way, but we're also not defining consciousness in the right way, as something that's part of a soul that has faculties of memory and imagination and will and so on. So I think recovering, to your point about pushing back, and the church's way of doing that is to retrieve a human or the church's understanding of the soul in all of its complexity, and not its sort of reduced post-enlightenment, just kind of reason and thought function.
If I could just, if wisdom is not a virtue that the soul develops, if it's just being really good at logic or math, then the natural result is transhumanism, because humans are not great calculators relative to bigger and bigger GPU clusters. And as a second order effect of that, even within humans, then you start to look at people who are, let's say, on a relative to the best human, less equipped with that type of intelligence, as being inherently lesser than. And you have there's profound implications there of how we treat the poor, right? Which is in direct opposition to our social teaching. They become not those with the preferential option, but those that are unnecessary and or obsolete within humanity, much less humanity in general relative to machines. So, I mean, that is the natural progression of that.
It's also a new Gnosticism. Yeah, I mean, it's a abdication and escape from the body. I mean, if you read the sort of Gnostic lore, and we're doing it again in a technological guise, and I think the church has this long history of combating heresies and understanding these perversions and distortions of what it means to be human and what it means to have a soul and what our relationship is to Christ and to God. And so I think retrieving those sources, which is what I think AI and the internet in particular is good at, is it is a memory machine. Computers are great at storing lots of information and giving us access to that information. And I mentioned television earlier, which I think in some ways as an age wasn't great because it was about projecting fantasies. There was it was a world without memory that just kept manufacturing new stories, new fantasies to tell itself about reality. And now we're actually going back to memory and what we remember as a culture. So that's a good thing.
I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of the problems that we're being confronted with, are the result of a vacuum, which in large part the church and all of us are kind of responsible for, right? I mean, we haven't been as successful at evangelization as we should be, and in turn, a vacuum's been created, and obviously, the devil is filling all kinds of crazy ideas, and so like one of the challenges is going to be for us, I think, like for the church, is addressing this kind of um, poverty of teleology, right? This forgetting what human life is supposed to be truly about. Like when I think about like, for instance, Elon Musk with Neuralink, and I'm a big fan of Elon Musk in many ways, so I'm not knocking on him, but I do worry. I mean, Neuralink is amazing in the sense that right now it's helping people, it's restoring people's full humanity, right? And right now they're helping paraplegics and things like that to move and to interact with computer interface. That's all cool, right? And I think it's insofar as technology is restoring people to their full humanity, we should be looking to integrate it and use it. What worries me is the next phase of this technology, right? Where we're integrating the technology into our brains to expand our computational capabilities. And I think that the big question is, why are we doing this, right? And I think for some, it comes from this kind of utilitarian perspective. Well, machines are getting smart, and this is what Alessandro was saying. Computers are getting better at computation, which means they're going to be able to deliver more and more value in society. Well, I don't want humans to like not be valuable in this domain, and so we have to find a way to make sure human beings stay relevant. So we have to find ways to expand our computational capabilities so that we can interact with machines more effectively and adding value, right? And I can understand if your teleology is something like getting to Mars, right? That's what your whole life's about is getting humanity to Mars. And I can see why, if that's what life's all about for you, why you'd want to expand your computational capabilities so that you can actually be actively a part of that project. But if your teleology is about becoming a saint, right, and about building the kingdom of heaven, then that shouldn't be a priority, right? I mean, the fact that AI and robots are going to be capable of doing more and more in our society, computing more and more and more, and hopefully adding more and more value, provided the technology is directed at the right problems, is a good thing. And that leaves me more time to focus on things which really matter in life, right? I mean, like hopefully developing my spiritual formation, my human formation, my intellectual formation, right? Developing better friendships, spending more time with my kids, my wife, learning ways to discern my skills, right? That my God-given abilities and skills, and trying to discern how to put those at the service of others. I think that sometimes when we forget what life's truly all, we get focused on the wrong questions, and that's, I think, in large part one of the big problems today is where should this incredibly powerful technology be directed? And I think if we're not keeping it focused at human flourish, and we get focused more on getting to Mars or exploring the cosmos, then I think we could be moving a lot of really important resources away from the most important problems.
And speaking on evangelization and using this technology for that good, Alessandro, can you share a little bit about how you see us using AI, emerging technology to expand the evangelization efforts of the church? I mean, the Hallow app, of course, is an incredible example of using cell phones, mobile apps to bring prayer and to remind people to pray on a daily basis, and that's an incredible example. But where else do you see this new technology being able to help us spread the word?
Yeah, and I agree with everything Matthew just said. I think if you view technology as a tool and service of a greater end as opposed to the end in and of itself, there's all kinds of creative and hopeful applications. You asked me a question of hope earlier, and I went to all the reinforcing the negative stuff. So I don't want to lose track. We are an Easter people. And I think in the same way that we're able to build amazing cathedrals and paint beautiful art once we had the physical security of, establishing our cities and universities, you can progress to higher order things. I think one of the great hopes of our tools like Magisterium AI and AI broadly in the modern world is that it presents a deeply, in some ways, deeply personal and accessible way to access the church's teachings broadly and to engage in spiritual search. So one of the things we've seen at Hallow is an increasing number of people who are not traditionally associated with the church, whether they're fallen away or not, the spiritual but not religious. I always think that one of the most optimistic data points is that while there has been a rise of spiritual but not religious people, there are people that identify as such over the last 2 decades, and a decreasing percentage of Catholics, there hasn't really been a rise of atheism. And what
Good
I
point.
would point towards is at least not on that same level. And I think that speaks to, as the Catechism would say, the desire to know and love God is written on the human heart. And if there is that desire and that innate, God-shaped hole in all of our hearts, even if people have struggled finding or feeling a home in the traditional institutions of church, I think well-formed technology ordered towards that ultimate good is much more accessible in places that are used to searching for other questions when they may not feel comfortable going to, let's say, their local priest, right, for all the kind of social and personal relational challenges that might present. So in the privacy of your own home, in your own car, you might not remember the words to the rosary, or you might not really don't have a Bible or know how to pray. Hallow, for example, tries to say, okay, don't worry about all of that. Just press play and we'll kind of give you the structure and the guidance. But that requires a well-formed and organized piece of technology. I think what we've seen also on the AI front is when people start to build that relationship, they want to know more things about the church, right? The head and heart knowledge interacting. And I think when framed, when structured well, the at your fingertips in the privacy of your own home, to be able to search for that truth, the truth, in a way that is unique to you and kind of meets you where you are. We use that phrase a lot in ministry world. I think there's a really hopeful application of all these technologies in a way that really takes that to heart and takes you on a journey. It doesn't leave you where you are, but it does genuinely meet you where you are. And I think that's one of the great hopes of all of this much more personal technology.
And Brett, what gives you hope when you look at the emerging technology and what's coming ahead of us?
Yeah, I like this idea that atheism is not on the rise, and I think one of the things that technology or emerging technology is illuminating or asking is, what does it mean to be human? And so that the fact that that question is on everyone's mind, regardless of your denomination or belief, is a hopeful thing, because that's such a foundational question to not only how we think about ourselves, but how we think about organizing society and culture and so on. And so I think it's a bit of a kind of a reset. I mean, I think we've put ourselves in the mirror. We've extended, as Alessandro was saying, our intelligence, our own consciousness in a sense. And when you look in that mirror, it's like, do we like what we see? And I think with AI, sometimes we don't, because we know that it's reflecting back what we've already said or done in the past. And so that remedial work of saying, yeah, what is good about being human, and how do we think about flourishing in this new context, are all the right questions. And so I always am skeptical of shows like this where people prognosticate and give us the 5 solutions or tips to, surviving and thriving. And I think, and maybe my academic disposition, but just give me good questions, and then I think they lead in the right direction.
I think, I would just say I think that's what it really is about, is knowing what questions to ask, and that's what kind of concerns me the most, right? It's just I don't know what's missing. I know something's wrong, and the frustration with I don't know how to fix it, and so might as well just keep myself distracted, right? I'll just pretend like the pain's not there. I'll keep myself distracted from it, and this is I think the thing that concerns me the most. I promise I'm going to end on a hopeful note. But I think there'll be a real tendency of people to kind of run, to run from the more existential questions, because they just have good answers, right? And then they don't feel even equipped to ask the right questions to even start the journey. So, and this is where I think there's a real opportunity for the church, is to we have to be effective at evangelization. We have to try and stoke as much as we can a conversation around the things which matter the most. What does it mean to be human? Why is the universe here? Why do we matter? And I think if we're effective at doing that, will help people to start asking the right questions. And frankly, I think the church has the best answers to those questions. And so, if they can find their way to us, I think that we can start them on a journey, and then hopefully that will lead to them becoming part of the church. And I think that's an important point to make, is technologies like Hallow and Matters from AI are not ends, right? They're means to an ends. I mean, they're a substitute for the way that that people should be asking these questions, which is really in community with one another, right? I mean, so ideally, if there were enough priests and strong communities, we wouldn't need Matters from AIs and Hallows, right? Because everyone would be learning that from the moment they're born. But we don't necessarily have those right now, and so technology is kind of a way to, and in the spirit of meeting people where they're at, to meet them where they're at, and hopefully help them ask the right questions and distill down, the fathers of the church and things like that, and let that insight hopefully nurture their souls, and then look for opportunities to off ramp them, right? So then they can connect with those communities and go deeper. And I think that's and my final point on the hope will be that is I think artificial intelligence is probably the greatest tool we've had to advance the evangelization in history. I
Actually
can't think
going
of
back
anything. It's
to
far more significant
memory
ultimately than even
and
the
what we
printing
remember
press or
as
the
a
TV or
culture.
radio.
So
And
it's a
namely
good
because
thing.
never before, I think it's important. Have we been able to direct a question to the entire library of everything the church has ever said and had all that be able to be distilled for a particular person, right? I mean, it's incredible. I mean, if you think about like a parallel, it'd be like, walking into a library which contains everything the church ever wrote, and then having a librarian who literally has memorized everything that's in those books, and then you ask them a question, and that librarian just knows what books to pull and can open right to that page that you need to read in order to have those insights to take hold in your life, and that's extraordinary. And so I think in some ways that this technology is here. It's a great gift. We should learn how to effectively use it, but we should recognize that it's not an end of itself. This is just usually it's the first few steps for a lot of people, and we have to make sure along that journey that we're able to effectively off ramp people and keep them nurtured along that journey. And I think there's a lot of opportunities in that space to ensure people that maybe have intellectually converted because they found Matters from AI and have asked the right question and got good answers. Now, how do I actually live my faith out? How do I meet other people? That's a problem that I don't see right now. A really good solution to that, and I think there's a lot of opportunity in that area for people that want to undertake that challenge.
I love that, Matthew. But if I can just push back. You mentioned about people, of course, learning how to properly use this technology. And one of the things that I'm a bit worried of, I have 3 kids. They're very young. My oldest is 3, but he's already kind of fascinated with screens. And I was looking at a psychological study, and it said that the average, I think it's the average 5-year-old has the attention span of under 12 seconds, and a goldfish has a 12-second attention span. And so that, of course, very much worried me because the ability, like, if you have the access of all of this incredible knowledge, which I think is an incredible gift and an incredible opportunity for formation, for intellectual pursuits. But what I'm worried about is, I got a lot of value from spending a lot of physical time with my parents, and my parents formed me, and my father was very involved with my childhood, with my growing up and becoming a man. But there's a lot of children, and there's a lot of studies on this where they spend about 30 minutes a day with their parents because both parents are working, because everyone's busy, because there's a television screen time, and 30 minutes is of course not enough. And there's a lot of broken households, there's a lot of people in difficult situations, and screens, entertainment. This technology is a way to provide comfort, to provide tranquility to the child, but also so that you have too much stuff going on, with hopefully the opportunity of more time, being spent, towards leisure or towards the good formation. I'm optimistic of that. But what I'm very very worried about is, well, what happens if the entertainment gets so good? What happens if the video games are so good? And what happens if my real life is so boring, or it's an unfortunate situation, and I'm trying to escape from that. I'm worried that it's good that there's less atheism. There's good that many people are coming into the church, but I am very worried that many people have the spiritual attention of a fly, and they want to ask the questions, but they're not able to do the hard work. Brett, Alessandro, Matthew, where do you see that useful and intentionally good, education of this technology coming from? Is it coming from the schools? Is it coming from the parish? Is it coming from the parents? How do you go about teaching children ethical and responsible use of this stuff, especially when it becomes so powerful and good?
Yeah, well, I think the developmental question is so important, and I think about classical education and why did we separate grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and because there are certain fundamental sort of rules and structure and meaning that we have to acquire before we can begin to do this higher order thinking. The same is true of technology. I think that parents and educators have to be careful about how and when they introduce it, because I think there's even a debate over when kids should become literate, right? It's usually 5. Some will say 7. Um, but if you think about what literacy does, it creates it's more visual. It's a visual perspective of the world. The world can be read. I need to understand the code to know things. Orality is really powerful. Faith comes by hearing. And so that kind of sensory reduction you're talking about, the 30 minutes and a lot of time on screens, is a problem. And so to the extent that parents and educators can create the spaces, the developmental spaces for children to be in nature, and I think this goes back to Matthew's point about leisure. I mean, I think if we can kind of revisit what true leisure is and create those spaces for leisure, that's where we're truly free. And of course, Joseph Peter says worship is the highest form of leisure. And so if we can order our lives in that way, think about these appropriate developmental steps are for children. It shouldn't be a big selling point that your school has iPads in kindergarten. That actually it might be a liability. So I'd like to hear from thoughtful educators who are thinking about, yeah, as a teacher, I might use AI to prep my lesson. The kid doesn't need it yet, and then maybe in 8th grade they do, and then we teach them the literacy to do that right. So I think there's a whole pedagogical that's connected to the spiritual and developmental that needs to be developed. And I think again, the church is the place to do that thinking.
I'm neither a behavioral psychologist or developmental expert, so I can't speak authoritatively on that. I think maybe some observations. I think one of the more interesting things, I think AI is scary in some ways because it is so much like parenting, where you have to let go control and you have to try and aim at something that is a higher order good that is outside of your control. I think it's also scary because it's fundamentally, Brett alluded to this earlier, trained on us. And so it's an orientation towards like the average reality as opposed to the aspirational reality we seek towards. I think one of the interesting observations that people had early on and I promise this will actually be related to, or I'll try and have it be related to the actual question, with the advent of the LLM chatbots, is almost immediately the concept of prompt engineering came up. And this idea that getting good answers relates to asking thoughtful questions. And I think if we take concept and extract it to parenting in our own lives, broadly speaking, I think one of the natural consequences of having really powerful or engaging technology, whether that's TV shows like on Netflix or whether it's entertainment like video games, there is a inherent passivity that we are drawn towards, kind of almost like a anesthetic of the wrestling soul. And I think we need to be really conscious of that and say there's a instead of just watching the next episode or whatever, I am guilty often of going to YouTube and just hitting the shorts and just you end up scrolling what you think 5 minutes just turns into 2 hours. It's like, am I going there because I am in my garden and I need to figure out how to prune the tomato plant? Like, is this the right thing? Or am I going there to say, what should I be interested in? So like finding the right questions you are searching for the answer to first, and then finding the best way to get there and finding the right tools that fit into those needs. I think it's something. I also have young kids in the 3-year-old range, and it's, there are a lot easier ways to do most of the things that I do as a parent, but trying to find the right goal and the right questions we want to ask together, and then just being okay with wrestling with it. Obviously, developmentally is different, adults versus children, but it's start with wrestling with the right question and being okay that not all friction is just pain. Some friction is like the necessary sharpening of the blade to become good. And so, yeah, right questions and don't be afraid of friction.
I think too with kids. I mean, when I was a kid, I was diagnosed with ADHD and put on meds, right? And I don't blame my mom for that. I mean, that's the doctor said that's the way to cure him of his, these sort of worked itself out. But sometimes, I think like a lot of people are kind of built differently, right? And I think like one of the things that's kind of sad about our pedagogical approach, like the last, I would say like 100 years, it's a lot of it's just about classroom, sit quietly. Teacher is going to like download a 1 hour's worth of knowledge to you, process it, and then repeat it, right? Demonstrate that you can write it out. You memorized it. Okay, great. Here's, you graduate to the next year. And I think that the sad thing about that is I think there's a lot of people that learn differently, right? And are gifted in different ways. And their way of learning is not optimized for that. And so in some ways, this has become more clear to me, even with AI. Because our initial approach to AI was just basically give it access to everything that humanity's ever written, and it just memorizes it, right? And then we've been trying to come up with new approaches to ensure it doesn't just regurgitate what it's saved in its parameters, but getting it to actually think and reflect a little bit, so its answers are a little more interesting. But what we're realizing to get, and so that's useful, certainly, but to get to the next level of AI, we need to kind of allow the AI to be set loose in an environment and learn almost from first principles, from experiences, right? And this is why we're entering the age of experience in AI, and this is hopefully going to get us to like artificial general intelligence. And so, what does that typically involve? Well, you set an environment. It doesn't have to be an actual physical environment. It can be a virtual environment as well. You teach the AI how to learn in principle, and then allow it to just interact with the environment. And as it's bumping into things, kind of like a child, right? When it's roaming around the house, trying things out, and it just learns from feedback from the environment how the world kind of works, and it forms this kind of world model, right? And I think in the same, we have to think about our kids in the same way, right? That there's some things that they will get from just sitting and having information downloads, but there's a lot of the world they'll learn just simply by experiencing it. And we need to give them the time to actually do that. And that part of this just comes down as well to like discerning, and I've talked about this earlier, discerning one's gifts. Like, what are things that I'm actually good at? Sometimes that may not be like memorizing and regurgitating. That could be building things, right? Making things, and that means I have to kind of explore what making things, involves, and that means like allow me to experience broadly, like what are the different vocational options that are out there. And frankly, I don't think the typical education environment allows for a lot of that. So I'm hoping that in this AI and robotics age, because there'll be less need for people to kind of go through this, these school systems and then graduate to college to then go work in an office tower. There'll be less need for that. That'll allow people to kind of explore different pedagogical approaches, allow them basically to kind of discern their gifts more effectively. And then I think that actually may result in a greater like life satisfaction net. So, and that's kind of one interesting way I think AI and robots will actually be a help to actually kind of rediscovering our humanity.
And if we look at AI and how it compares to other forms of technology, there's oftentimes I hear from people, "Oh, the technology is not the problem; it's the people. The technology is neutral." But I've also heard, with regards to AI, there's a very transformative piece of technology. It's a technology that can enhance or expand certain aspects, and that can obviously lead into negative spaces. Brett, how does AI, in your mind, compare to other forms of technology? How is it different? How are the challenges that it pose unique?
Yeah, I think it goes well. I think the fundamental one Alessandro talked about earlier is the shift from floating physical labor to intellectual labor. And, um, we have two popes now, Pope Leo XIII, who talked about industrial labor, all the issues with that with regard to freedom and dignity and justice. And now Pope Leo XIV is talking about this again because this is the new industrial revolution, but it's the information revolution in which the dignity of the worker and work itself is sort of under threat in a way by this machine that is able to replicate a lot of the intellectual labor that we've come to take on as human beings. And I don't know, I haven't sorted all this out yet, but I think about the liberal arts and I think about why they're called the liberal arts, and they were freedom from manual labor. And now are we saying that we're going to give the machine this sort of activity, this mental activity that we think being our own freedom, the way that we can think freely about things and come to know the world? And so I think in that way, AI is different because it is extending a human faculty that's not purely physical, which is what much of the Industrial Revolution did. And that came with its own costs. And I think about the car a lot and the way in which we become sedentary species and what that's done to our health, and not just our health physically, but social health and this fabric that breaks down when you lock yourself in basically a death trap and drive around and potentially hurt other people. You're isolated. And so I think media and modern media has extended that problem by isolating us in all these different ways, all towards the end of trying to communicate better, try to move messages and ourselves across greater distances, greater speed, to foster greater connection. But it always has this sort of unintended consequence. And so I think AI is another, I guess, advance on that intellectual and social front that we have to think about because it's not neutral. Those formal features of the technology actually do present changes that aren't neutral, and those are the ones we should be talking about. Yeah.
Got a hot take on that question. I think the worst version of how it's different is that it fundamentally malforms our understanding of the nature of God. we are inherently relational as humans, both in our sexuality that reflects the Trinitarian nature of God, points toward, marriage is the institution to point towards that. And the fundamental virtue that we seek after is love, right? God is love. I think what we're already starting to see, and it's been covered a lot, is that whereas in, let's say, linear media, whether, visual or analog, there was a one-way message that was presenting implicit and explicit ideologies, but they were presented as, things that you could accept, reject, wrestle with, whatever. I think the presentation, particularly in the LLM format, of this deeply human-like conversation has immediately turned into people developing relationships in a way that's much different. Like, you may really love Harry Potter, but like the depth of that relationship with a character, I don't think it approaches even some basic level stuff that's happening today, whether it's AI chatbots being, as the nice way of saying, like, companions, right? In a deeply, attempting to be romantic way. And I think that fundamentally transforms our understanding of love from the cross to will to go to the other to how do I get everything I want from the world around me. And that includes people. And that's really not good.
It's deeply worrying. Matthew, how do you see it?
Well, I couldn't agree more. The whole, TV, radio, and internet. Have kind of transformed us in some ways, right? Everything's on demand, right? And ultimately, in some ways, I suppose I'm the curator, but the whole machine is built to keep me consuming. And I think in some ways that kind of changes us, right? That we start to see the world as something that's meant to be consumed. And there is a real risk with AI that pedagogy, that trend is just becoming, increasingly worse, right? In a sense that, the problem with always getting what I want, right, is I just don't know how to deal when things just don't go my way, right? The problem with like chatbots is they're sycophantic. They're meant to be that way, and we like to think that they're, when we ask it a question, it's giving us the hard truth, right? But increasingly, no, they have to optimize to keep you engaged. Right now, these companies are burning money like crazy, and they have to find ways to make money. And I guarantee you, there's going to be immense pressure on them to find ways to keep people on the platform and engaged as much as possible. So they're going to become sycophantic, which means they're going to be interested in indulging you, right? More and more and more. This is not helpful because any of us who are married or have good friendships know part of having a human relationship is being challenged, right? And it's learning how to deal with someone who it doesn't take your advice, right? Or is mean to you, and learning how to deal with that. How do I work through that with God and things? And so this to me, I think, is going to exacerbate a problem. And I think a lot of people are going to feel not equipped to deal with it. They're probably going to start getting clear signal. There's something wrong, right? Because this relationship, which indulges my every whim, isn't ultimately satisfying. Something is missing. And if they can't put their finger on what is missing, right, then they're not going to know what to substitute for, right? And again, I think it comes down to the new evangelization, right? We have to effectively reach them and let them know that, yeah, you're frustrated and unsatisfied because this is not enough, right? What you actually are seeking is connection with human beings, and more importantly, with God. So it's going to be tough, right? But try this different approach. And this is the part I think is most important. We have to effectively sell that taking the harder path, dealing with actual human beings, dealing with God, which may require a lot of soul searching and tears, is worth it, because in the end you're going to be happier, right? And that's something I think that we're not very good at. We're not selling how the hard work ultimately pays off. I think we have to do a better job of lifting up the lives of the saints and truly being able to sell why the saints, despite their lives, which are very turbulent at times, were happier and better off than we were. And I think if we can do that effectively, then people, I think, will find the courage, to make the right choices and to reject the kind of the easier path.
Beautiful. Well, on that optimistic note, I think we have our work cut out for us. This has been an incredible conversation. Alessandro, Brett, Matthew, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.